The wind cut through the arid fields of Judea as the young man wrapped his cloak around his shoulders, his feet covered in dust, and his mind filled with a mixture of remorse and understanding. Once, he was celebrated, surrounded by laughter, outstretched hands, and voices that greeted him as a brother. Wine flowed, banquets were plentiful, and the city seemed like a paradise for someone bearing the weight of a newly claimed inheritance. However, it only took the last coin slipping through his fingers for the very mouths that once praised him to fall silent, the very hands that welcomed him to close, and the very eyes that sought him to turn elsewhere. Now, only the echo of his own steps remained on the dusty road, a journey back home that seemed as long as the distance between illusion and truth. Little by little, the weight of understanding became more suffocating than the hunger that burned in his stomach. He had become a stranger to those who once surrounded him, but more importantly, he had become a stranger to himself. Abundance masked loneliness, and the noisy company concealed the fact that there had never truly been a genuine connection. He realized too late that his wealth did not buy loyalty, only convenience. The city did not belong to him, and he had never truly belonged to the city. And as the golden sun hid behind the mountains, a thought struck him like a cold blade. Perhaps loneliness was the true path to truth. The first shock came when he realized that his absence made no impact. No one came searching for him, no voice called his name. The streets that once seemed so familiar were now merely empty alleys, indifferent to his existence. With each step, he understood that his solitary journey was inevitable, not because he was rejected, but because there had never been real belonging. Wealth had not only attracted flatterers, it had isolated him from the truth. But now, without gold to distract him, he saw things as they were, fragile, fleeting, and rootless. It was loneliness that stripped away illusions and forced him to face the essence of his own soul. Then hunger struck, not just hunger for bread, but for purpose, for meaning. He spotted a field and, with shame crushing his pride, offered himself as a servant. The payment? The permission to share the pig's food. The once noble man was now a beggar in the midst of the mud. Yet, amid the misery, clarity emerged. This was not punishment, it was consequence. He had sought freedom in abundance but found only slavery in excess. Now, reduced to the minimum, he realized that true freedom was never in what he possessed, but in who he was. Loneliness taught him what banquets could never offer. Night fell, and he remained there, among the pigs, watching the moon reflected in the dirty water of the trough. The silence enveloped him like a heavy cloak, but for the first time, he felt no fear. There was something sacred in that emptiness, as if God were there, not in a golden temple, not on a perfumed altar, but in the raw silence of his own insignificance. What once seemed like abandonment now revealed itself as a calling. Could it be that his father was still waiting for him? The memory of home ignited a warmth in his chest, a spark of hope mixed with shame. He was no longer worthy of being called a son, yet perhaps he could be a servant. At least he would have bread, at least he would have a home. And so, without further hesitation, he rose. Each step back was a blow against the pride that had blinded him. The road seemed longer than when he had left, not because the distance had changed, but because he was no longer the same. The young man who had left in arrogance now returned, broken, willing to accept even the smallest scrap of mercy. He rehearsed the words he would say, the confession he would make. But when the house finally emerged on the horizon, something unexpected happened. His father, the one he had dishonored, was already there, waiting for him. And before he could utter a single word, he was embraced by arms that demanded no explanation. For the first time, loneliness dissipated, not because he was once again surrounded by others, but because he had finally found himself. The impact of that embrace broke the last chains around his heart. He had expected judgment, expected disapproving looks, perhaps even indifference. But there was his father, running to meet him as if time had never passed, as if the mistakes had never existed. The words he had rehearsed dissolved in his mouth, replaced by silent tears streaming down his dust-streaked, humiliated face. "Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son." But before he could finish, before he could offer his servitude as penance, he was interrupted. His father did not want a servant. He wanted his son back. And so it was that, in the very place where he expected to be rejected, he was restored. A new cloak draped his shoulders, covering the shame of his past. The ring slid onto his finger, sealing his belonging, and the fattened calf was prepared for the feast he had never imagined he would have. Those who had forgotten him in the city were now distant, but it did not matter. His identity had never been found in crowds, in banquets, or in fleeting riches. Loneliness had taught him that true bonds are not broken by time or mistakes. He had left believing that he needed to lose himself to find himself. But in the end, it was in his return that he finally discovered who he truly was. Yet not everyone celebrated his return. Outside, among the shadows of the evening, his older brother watched the feast with clenched fists. He had never left, never squandered the inheritance, never wallowed in the mud alongside the pigs. Always faithful, always obedient, always present. And yet, there had never been a celebration for him. Resentment burned in his chest like embers hidden under ashes. "All these years I have served you, and you never even gave me a kid goat to celebrate with my friends. But this son of yours, who squandered everything, receives a feast?" The bitterness overflowed, yet his father was not angered. He only smiled, with the patience of one who understands something the other still could not comprehend. "My son, you are always with me, and all that I have is yours." Those words should have been a comfort, yet they sounded like an enigma. The older brother saw fidelity as a burden, while the younger, who had tasted ruin, now understood the value of grace. True blessing was never in material inheritance, but in the relationship with the Father. The younger had to lose everything to understand that. The older never realized that he already had everything. The feast was not a reward for sins, but a celebration of return, of rebirth. And in the contrast between the two brothers, the truth became evident. Loneliness can lead to repentance and restoration, but obedience, without love, may be just another form of being lost. The music and voices echoed through the house, but outside, silence persisted. The older brother remained there, hesitant, caught between pride and understanding. Would he enter and rejoice at his brother's return? Or would he remain in the bitterness of his own self-righteousness? The choice was his, and his father would not force him. The younger had learned through pain that grace is an undeserved gift. The older still needed to understand that it was not his obedience that gave him value, but the simple fact of being a son. Just as the younger found redemption in loneliness, the older still needed to find liberation from the invisible weight he carried. Inside the house, the feast continued. Reconciliation had taken place, the lost was found, the dead revived. Yet the story remained open, with no answer for the older brother. Perhaps because this was not merely the story of two brothers, but of all of us. Some lose themselves in excess and discover truth in emptiness. Others live in discipline, but never experience the joy of grace. In the end, the true question was not who was right or wrong, but who would choose to enter and join the celebration. For in the Father's kingdom, the invitation is always open to those who return broken, as well as to those who never realized that they already belonged.